Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jennifer Leff, one of the managing directors at MusiCares. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with MusiCares, we are the nonprofit of the Recording Academy that was founded in 1989 to safeguard the well-being of the music community. MusiCares helps the humans behind the music because music gives so much to the world. And our programs include providing direct assistance around basic living needs, facilitating access to medical and dental services, and providing mental health and addiction recovery support, including cyber support groups. We help everyone from the singer, songwriter, to the engineer, to the promoter, to the tour bus driver. So for more information, please go to musicares.org. We are really proud to recognize Pride Month and are really fortunate to partner with the Episcopal Actors Guild, which is a New York City-based entertainment relief organization whose mission is to provide emergency aid and support to professional performers of all faiths, certainly people who are undergoing financial crises. And we're quite grateful to have SAGE partner for this webinar. You'll hear more from our guests, but SAGE is the oldest and largest organization dedicated to serving LGBT older adults. So we are thrilled to have Bill Gross, Assistant Director of Special Programs, and Julie Ugoretz, Program Coordinator of the Friendly Visitors and SAGEConnect programs. They will talk about SAGE, talk about this unique community with whom they work, and certainly some of the experiences and what they've seen over the past 15 months during COVID. So thank you both for being here, and we look forward to hearing about SAGE and the aging community.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. We're so happy to be here. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay. So as Jennifer mentioned, we are here from SAGE. I'm the program coordinator of Friendly Visiting. Bill is the assistant director of special programs. And today we're just going to talk a little bit about what makes the LGBT community unique when it comes to the experience of aging, and also the work that SAGE does to meet those unique needs. So we're going to start with sort of a brief overview of the community, then we'll dive a little bit more deeply into SAGE and our work, and especially the impact of COVID on our work. And then we'll talk a little bit about two social support programs that we have, given the amount of isolation that this community can face. So we thought we'd talk through some of the key terms that we'll be using today and that are important to our community. So as these are coming up, we'll see there's the acronym LGBTQ+, and all of the identities that are encompassed in that. And then these other words, heterosexism, cissexism, used to describe the oppression that trans people and LGBTQ people face. And then the words cisgender and transgender, gender dysphoria. And then Bill, will you talk a little bit about the word queer and sort of its place in our community and for SAGE folks?
I absolutely will. Maybe I'll talk about both gender dysphoria and queer, because I bet gender dysphoria is a phrase that a lot of our folks don't know. Gender dysphoria was the new term that was applied to transgender folks, meaning the distress that sometimes is caused by having one's assigned sex be different than one's identity. And it's used a lot in the social work community. And I think names are important, and even something like gender dysphoria can be stigmatizing. And likewise with queer, I think we found within the past 10 years or so that especially younger people have reclaimed the word queer in a positive way, to really state one's identity in this community. We're reticent sometimes to use it at SAGE because for many of our participants, SAGE serves older adults primarily over the age of 60. For many of our participants growing up in the 30s, 40s, 50s, that was the kind of primary pejorative term that was used to bully and oppress them. So it's interesting that we're at this crossroads, right? That I'm sure many agencies that serve younger LGBTQ people use the word queer quite a lot, and SAGE, we're still reticent to do so.
Right. Thanks, Bill. So true that names are important, and it's important to get them right and to ask people what terms they prefer to use. So this is sort of a very broad overview of some of the moments that might have happened for some of our clients as they were growing up. So as you see at the sort of older end of our age range, folks in their 90s and even in their hundreds, that's a particular experience of being a part of the LGBT community, followed by the 1930s and the psychological association's treatment of LGBT people and that identity really being pathologized. 1940s, of course, we have the Holocaust as a major historical trauma, especially for LGBT people, followed by continued persecution and oppression by the American Psychiatric Association. And then coming into the 60s, we see the start of the gay liberation movement, Stonewall riots, the start of Pride. So as you can see, these are all aspects of our clients' lives that have affected them.
I think it's interesting to note, we have several of our clients who were at Stonewall during the riots back in 1969. For those of you who aren't familiar with Stonewall, we're actually going to be circling back to it at the end of our presentation, but it was 3 nights worth of riots in June of 1969. It's why we celebrate Pride Month in New York City in June. It is thought of as the start of the LGBTQ civil rights movement, although there were certainly other events before then, other protests, other riots, often involving people of color and trans people that happened across the country in the decades before that. Cooper Donuts in California, Los Angeles, protests outside of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, a sip-in at Julius's Bar, which is currently the oldest gay bar in New York City, that happened in the 1960s. But Stonewall was a pivotal point. And again, remember it because we're going to be circling back a little later.
Right. And I think it's also important to note that there's probably many other events that are left off this timeline and that have been significant throughout the lives of our clients.
For sure. So the LGBTQ older adult population is a growing population. It's growing because of the aging of the baby boomers, right? It's also growing, in visibility because more people from these generations are feeling more confident in being out about their sexual orientation and gender identity. By 2030, as many as 7 million LGBTQ older adults in the United States. And we're going to be talking a little bit about just 2 of the things that make these populations different when we look at how we work with LGBT older adults at SAGE, right? And we're going to be going into a little detail around this. The first has to do with caregiving and getting support, and the fact that many more older adults live alone, rely on other adults for support and caregiving. And the second has to do with discrimination, and specifically the kind of mainstream systemic discrimination from mainstream organizations and how that impacts the way our clients, our participants of SAGE seek care, and how it means that we have to craft the way that the services that we give them, because it's a very different experience. And Julie's going to go into some of those specifics now.
Yes, thanks, Bill. So here we'll see a representation of this first difference in caregiving. So this is the general population, their rates of aging as a single person, having no children, and then living alone. And you'll see when we compare that with the LGBT community, we see that the rates of these experiences are much higher. And we can think about the ways that this means that the sort of vertical caregiving structure that a lot of heterosexual families have is not present. So people might not have children to step into the caregiving role. And at the same time, folks who are LGBT might be called on to caregive even more because they don't have children themselves. So this is often what it looks like for our elders as they get older. It's peers caring for each other, neighbors, friends, ex-partners who really step into that role that otherwise family might take on, and also that otherwise sort of social services more broadly might take on. And we've seen in the second point why that can be difficult. So again, yeah,
And
Bill.
can I also add to that, that just to really drive home when it comes to caregiving, right? By the way, we have questions that have already come in, and we will definitely answer them at the end. Feel free to type in other questions. We'd love to answer them at the end of this presentation if we have time. And one of the questions that people had, Julie, was the specifics of when it comes to caregiving and the specific needs of LGBTQ older adults. And I think Julie just mapped it out really well, that could you go back just a couple of slides to, if someone is, one more, is single, doesn't have children, and lives alone, and has just been released from the hospital with a broken hip, their experience of their recovery is going to be so different, being single, having no children, and living alone. And specifically, when Julie talks about the kind of horizontal caregiving structure that a lot of LGBTQ older adults have, on one level, that's a really beautiful thing, right? And especially, I mean, I think back to the stories of the 1980s, especially the early 1990s when it comes to HIV, and peers coming together to take care of their own. It's a really beautiful and wonderful thing. The issue, though, happens if that person who's just been discharged from the hospital with a broken hip is there alone at the home, and their primary caregiver is the person in the apartment down the hall who is 85 years old, right, and might have some limited physical or cognitive capacities themselves. That's where we run into trouble. There is something about a vertical caregiving model with a younger adult taking care of an older one, where there's a bit more chance for a speedier and more complete recovery. The reason we're talking about this is in setting up what we're going to be saying about SAGE's services, right? And why we put the programs we do in place, because these caregiving links are sometimes not complete in our participants. Take it away, Julie.
Absolutely. And it is that, being that service link that is so important. So as discussed earlier, there's a history of discrimination and mistreatment by a lot of institutions that we come to rely on, especially as we get older. And this creates some unique difficulties. Bill, I know you were going to talk a little bit specifically about the medical and psychiatric institutions.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So just looking at these big six, before I get to medical, looking at these big six, I think most people in the United States, most of the general population, would probably see most or all of these as being mainstream institutions that are there to protect and serve, especially people who are vulnerable, right? So services around housing, right? The different agencies that protect people's housing, right? Religious organizations that are there for someone when they're feeling disconnected or need a sense of community. Certainly the medical institution, doctors being kind of these models, these protectors, law enforcement, military, family. When we talk about the older adults, these generations of LGBTQ older adults, very often these are the institutions that have oppressed them. So Julie, you can start going through these. So housing, you know, the possibility of, you can actually slide through these, the possibility of eviction, um, obviously excommunication. What Julie had mentioned when it came to medical, and I mentioned the DSM, which is the list of psychological illnesses, the list of mental illnesses that psychiatrists and psychologists use to diagnose people. Well, up until 1973, homosexuality was listed as a mental illness, right? Even today, being transgender is to some degree listed as a mental illness, or the dysphoria is listed as a mental illness, which I think is, I won't get on my soapbox, which I think is problematic. 1973, when the change was finally made in the DSM to take homosexuality off, seems to most of us like a pretty long time ago, right? But for one of our lesbian clients who is in her 90s, 1973 would have been when she was middle-aged. And what impact is that then going to have on the way she still seeks treatment, specifically for psychiatric issues, but also just how comfortable is she going to be going to her doctor, talking about maybe the sex she's having or the partners she's having. We find very often that access to quality and compassionate medical care is such a stumbling block for many of our participants at SAGE to have a doctor who they can talk to about issues having to do with sex and sexuality, certainly about issues having to do with gender identity. Is hard in New York. And for those of you who are outside of New York, I can only imagine how much harder it is in areas that aren't major metropolitan cities. And we can go through the rest of these: police brutality, military, family. I will say about the military, one of our big programs at SAGE is called SAGE Vets. And it's for LGBT older adults who served in the armed forces. And one thing which is just incredible, one thing that SAGE Vets can do is that they can upgrade other than honorable discharge. If people were discharged because of their sexual orientation, because of their gender identity, SAGE Vets works with legal firms to try to reverse or upgrade those discharges. And on one level, that's wonderful because it means that some of our vets can then receive the benefits that they were promised and have deserved all these years. People who serve, we have people at SAGE who served in World War II. So on one hand, on a practical level, it means that they and their spouses have more financial and logistical support through the VA. But on the other hand, upgrading those discharges takes the level of stigma and shame back from a military that put this on them so many years ago simply for being gay, simply for being trans. And then, of course, the last one was family. And we know, and Julie's going to be covering this in a minute, or maybe I am, I forget. I think it's Julie. We know that that very often people of these generations create their own family, which is such a beautiful thing. But what happens when people age and their family of choice, which is usually around their same age, what happens then when those people start to lose capacity or start to pass away or start to move away? Um, Again, this is all setting up SAGE's services. How do we give support to older adults whose peer circle may be diminishing?
Thank you, Bill. And I think, attention that we have in talking about this is balancing talking about these experiences of oppression and vulnerabilities, and also the resilience and the survival that are also very much a part of this community. So, an early study found that LGB, not including trans older adults, had higher risks of things like addiction and mental health struggles. And it's important for us to note that it's not because of these identities that people are experiencing these struggles, but it is the experience of homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, all of these factors that create these disparities in health. And a term that we use to refer to this is minority stress, which is the health impacts of a lifetime of being part of a minority identity. And we can also think about the ways that different identities intersect here. So how a lifetime of racism can intersect with a lifetime of transphobia, and how all of these can contribute to a person's experience of growing older in our society. Yes. But as we said, there's this tension because our sage elders are always coping with this experience. One way that this can happen is becoming more invisible or closeted as we get older. I think more than half of LGBT older adults worry that they will have to go back into the closet in a long-term care setting in order to receive adequate care. And then we also see that folks develop a really strong sense of self-reliance. So because there hasn't been family support, institutional support, medical support, they rely on themselves. And while this can be really good, this can also be challenging because, of course, we need each other. In the same way, people can have a very limited support of social circle of social support. And especially as we age, that gets harder because folks move away, folks pass on, and that circle can shrink and shrink. And then the idea of home becomes even more important for a lot of our elders. It's a place where they can be out, where they can feel safe. And being able to stay in the home is often really, really important. Bill.
Yeah. So I don't think we can talk about these generations without talking about HIV. And actually, I run Sage Positive, which is a service, all kinds of workshops, social events, support groups for people living with HIV, many of whom are long-term survivors who have been living with HIV for 30 plus years since the mid 80s, but some others who are more recently diagnosed as well. Sage Positive also encompasses all sexual wellness programming at Sage, and I just want to put a plug in for this. I know it's not kind of what our presentation today is about, but really one of my favorite activities to run at Sage are these workshops that we call super sex workshops. And they are an opportunity for LGBT older adults to come together with a small panel of a doctor, a social worker. I usually moderate some of them. And just talk about sex and intimacy as we age. And I just think it's such an opportunity to normalize people's experience. There are people in the room who haven't had sex for 10 years. There are people in the room who are having a lot of sex and perhaps with one or more partners. There are people in the room who've been in a primary relationship for the last 50 years and have only had intimacy with that person. There's such a variety of experience, but to give people the opportunity to come in and ask questions and to talk about it is so important. And those are open to people regardless of their status. So they may be positive, they may be negative, they may not know their status. It's an opportunity for all. But this is an incredible statistic that 65% of the people living with HIV in the United States are over age 50. Sometimes the phrase is called the graying of AIDS, the graying of HIV, because people are living longer and better lives with HIV. Some people are living better and longer lives with HIV now. Older adults continue to be diagnosed with HIV. People over age 50, 17%. That's a number that's both in New York State and it's actually consistent with federal numbers as well. And then the last statistic is that many of those diagnoses receive a concurrent AIDS diagnosis. And what that means is that generally that person perhaps has waited for a long time before testing. So their HIV has progressed to the point of AIDS. We talked before about difficulties in talking about sex or sexual activity with doctors. This is another important reason why it's so important to make that connection. And one of the questions that we got before the presentation was how to find LGBT appropriate affirming medical care. Before the end of today's session, Julie and I are going to give you our emails, but also we're going to put in the number for the SAGE LGBT older adult hotline, which people can call from all across the country, and they can speak to someone. These people are qualified to be a counselor, a peer counselor to them, but also they can look up these kinds of things, and they have various databases where they can find LGBT affirming healthcare.
That hotline is such a wonderful resource.
It really is. And maybe, Julie, while I'm doing these next couple of slides, would you mind Googling that number? I always forget. It's not a hard number, but I always forget.
Yeah. Did that make the presentation go away just now?
It did. I can, or it just minimized it. So I can do it actually. I'll do that while after I present. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No problem.
Julie and I have worked together for a couple of years now, and specifically the last couple of years, and we are so in sync. So I just want to spend a moment talking about SAGE. I know that we've mentioned it a lot, but we haven't kind of given you the specifics. SAGE was founded in 1978 in New York City. And so of course the 1970s, that was a time that was where LGBT people were increasingly visible, but they were usually younger LGBT people. This was an era of disco, of rock and roll, of partying in New York City, and a group of activists and social workers came together, realizing that there was a need for older adults to provide them with services that would be for their age group. And so SAGE was born. At the heart of SAGE, and Julie, yes, are our SAGE centers. We currently have 6 SAGE centers throughout the boroughs. We have 2 in Manhattan. I'm going to get this wrong. 2 in Manhattan, 1 in the Bronx, 2 in Brooklyn, and 1 in Staten Island. And these are senior centers, which with activities that one would expect to find to some degree at senior centers. Perhaps they're more musical theater and opera classes than might be at other senior centers, but otherwise, yoga, meals, language classes, book discussion groups, support groups. Julie, do you want to talk a little bit about this past year in COVID and how that has impacted the programming at senior centers?
Yeah, so obviously our centers haven't been open for in-person programming recently at all. And that has meant we've shifted to virtual programming. So we have, the number is so large, something like more than 100 every day. Online programming for people, often mirroring the programming that was a part of the senior center. So those seen support groups, Bill's HIV positive group. I run a caregiver support group that's also become virtual. So those virtual programs have really been good for some people because they've increased their ability to access the services we offer. And while it's frustrating for some people to not be able to go into the center, and it can be really difficult in a lot of ways, it's also been an opportunity for us to reach more folks during this time when it's so needed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing to watch some of these remote programming. I mean, we are on the cusp of returning to normal, but to watch some of these yoga classes and such that have been filmed with people in their apartments, it's really, really beautiful. Okay, so lots of programming, meals, nutrition, benefits, all kinds of classes when it comes to health education, fitness, arts, and culture. Um, in our care management department, which is the program that Julie and I work out of, we have these services listed on the screen. Case management. One thing that isn't on here that somehow fell off is our caregiving program. And as Julie said, she runs a support group for caregivers where, am I correct, Julie, that either the caregiver or the person or the care recipient or both is an LGBT older adult? Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah.
Great. One of the questions we were asked actually beforehand was, what are the resources for caregivers? We
Ah,
have quite a few. One of them being support groups, but we're also able to offer some financial support to caregivers sometimes, some arts and recreational therapy for caregivers, some case assistance to caregivers. I've talked about a couple of the programs on this list here, Sage Vets and Sage Positive, our veterans program and our program for people living with HIV. And Julie is going to take it away because these next two programs, SAGEConnect and Friendly Visiting, are the programs that she has been adeptly running for the past year.
thank you, Bill. Yes. So in my past year, I
Oh,
forgot one thing.
and luckily to answer another question that came in the chat, what
Oh,
about senior LGBT friendly housing? SAGE actually has in the past year and a half opened up affordable housing, senior housing in Crotona Park in the Bronx and Fort Greene in Brooklyn. Those are now closed in terms of people have moved in or in the process of moving in, but that will continue to be an opportunity for people. The helpline, the LGBT older adult helpline, which I will put in the chat, I do have now, can also address housing needs when it comes to referrals and stuff like that. Take it away, Julie.
wonderful. I'm glad we didn't forget that because it's so important. So to speak a little bit about our Friendly Visiting program, it was founded in 1979, just 1 year after SAGE's founding as an organization. And I really see this as Friendly Visiting being central to SAGE's mission of supporting older adults in reducing social isolation. And I think it's also really important to note that our founders saw this as an issue even in the 1970s and 80s. So the Friendly Visiting program has about 90 volunteers who make visits, weekly visits. Now everything is over the phone, of course, for the past year or so, though we hope to return to in-person visiting really soon. These volunteers are matched for at least a year and they form really special connections. I think our oldest pair has been together for about 20 years. It's a really substantial connection that these people make with each other. Went backwards. And yes, so Friendly Visiting There's a lot of reasons why volunteers come to us, and I'm sure we can imagine some of them. Some might even be coming up for you right now as we speak. So there's this idea of connection to grandparents and older people. Not everybody has a grandparent who identifies as a part of the queer community, and this is a chance to sort of mimic that relationship and get close to someone older, and to have the sort of guidance and storytelling and mentorship that an older person offers to a younger person. There's also a sense of wanting to give back to a generation that came before us and to a generation that experienced a lot of difficulties. So acknowledging that we are where we are today as a community because of the work of these elders, whether they were sort of activists on the front lines or just folks living their regular lives. And then also a lot of our volunteers are thinking about themselves as they get older, the kind of care they want, what they hope to have as they grow older. And it can be really wonderful to see a positive role model of someone older in the LGBT community. We hear often that a lot of people don't grow up with these sorts of images. Here are some photos of our lovely matches. As you can see, people grow really close through these weekly visits. We also offer monthly supervision meetings for volunteers. So there's a lot of support in the experience of working with someone who's older and someone who can have someone who has service needs. So how do we support that person while also maintaining our boundaries and taking care of ourselves as volunteers is something we talk about a lot. Here you'll see a photo from the center. Really wonderful special connections that get made through this program. Here's some feedback that we've gotten. As you can see, the program makes a really big impact on the folks who it serves. Even folks who are newly out, we have them as well, in addition to folks who have been out for much of their life. You'll see the sense that people become like family, this sort of familial connection that grows from chosen family. And then I also think we hear a lot that like these visits are the highlight of my week, or I look forward to the call every week. So sort of, especially for a person who's homebound or doesn't get out a lot, it can be so important to have a friendly face, someone who's there, just to be a friend, not to, take their blood pressure or anything like that, just to be a support. And yes, so the program originally serves mostly homebound people, but serves other older adults, really anyone who's facing social isolation. And then SAGEConnect is our newest program. It was started in May of 2020. So we are just passing the year mark, and we have made so far about 530, to be updated, matches between volunteers and clients, which is really exciting. And that program is a little bit lighter than friendly visiting. It's a 6-week commitment, so not a full year. And these calls are also about half an hour as opposed to a couple of hours in the case of friendly visiting. But still, we hear the same feedback. This call is the highlight of my week. I feel like we're family. I feel like we've known each other for years. SAGEConnect makes really wonderful, important connections as well. And as you can see on this map, which is slowly growing more and more blue, SAGEConnect is a national program. So we have folks all over the country. We have matches connecting, from the Bronx to North Carolina. We have folks in Hawaii. There's really a big range of people who are connected with each other, which is a really exciting aspect of the program. And we invite folks who are watching today to send us an email, let us know if you're interested in either SAGEConnect or friendly visiting. Obviously, our space is limited and we can't take on everyone, though we appreciate the support. If you would like to be involved, we really encourage you to reach out to us because we would love to have you.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have some time for questions, and some of them we
Yeah.
see some of them have been coming in, but do feel free, just leave that up for just a second, Julie. Do feel free to reach out to us with potential referrals. If you'd like to volunteer, I think if you want to volunteer for either of these programs, best to email Julie since she runs them. I did put in the chat the LGBT older adult hotline, but I'll also say it. It's 877-360-LGBT. 877-360-LGBT. We've had it for several years. You would think I would remember it by now, but I don't. So Julie, do you want to unshare your PowerPoint and let's answer a
Sure.
couple of these questions?
Absolutely.
So I'll lob you the first one if you want.
Please, yeah.
Someone had a question. I'll read the exact. I won't paraphrase it. At what age do you consider someone aged? And is the New York City LGBTQ Center for all others? All other ages, I guess. Or, well, or other ages and other sexual orientations and gender identities, maybe? You can answer it all.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's certainly a fluid term. For most folks, services start at the age of 60, but there's a couple groups who have been sort of historically underserved and under-resourced that we want to give access to. So those include veterans, trans folks, and folks who are HIV or AIDS positive. Those folks can start accessing services at the age of 55. I wouldn't say we call 55 aged, but just when we, welcome people to our services. And then the question about the senior centers, all folks are welcome there. I think you have to be 60 and older in order to officially participate and have free meals. Yeah, Bill, does
That's
that
right.
answer it? Is there more?
That's absolutely right. Since we're funded by the Department for the Aging, we're mandated to only serve people at our senior centers who are 60 and up in terms of, as Julie said, the meals, the programs. But if someone is in one of those populations living with HIV, trans, or a veteran, we do offer other services for them starting at age 50. Good. Yes, very good work.
And all are welcome, all orientations.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because they know we have really good food, for one thing. There's lots of people at those dinners. Let's see. Why don't we both answer this question, Julie? What resources are available for those facing discrimination, whether it be housing, medical, workplace? We do, SAGE does partner with law firms and has pro bono lawyers that we sometimes work with who can help our participants if they have specific legal concerns, and smaller legal concerns like creating a power of attorney and a will, up to discrimination cases. Very often we would refer someone for pro bono work if we can at another agency for that.
Right. And I think a real benefit of SAGE's work is that we are sort of known as the spot for aging LGBT people, which means that we're also able to coordinate with organizations across the city and across the country who know our services and who have services that are important of their own. So we try to connect people to this sort of network of folks who are able to serve them.
Yeah. There's a question about trauma and that trauma envelops those individuals who came out or didn't come out decades back, and how do organizations like SAGE support the trauma that might be occurring with these populations, especially when mental health is an added stigma given one's age? It's such a good question, and I'm going to rely on both of us, I think, to give an answer. Julie, do you want to take a first stab at it?
Yeah, so the question is, how do we serve folks who are impacted by trauma?
Yes.
Yeah, it's so important that our services are accessible to people who might have qualms about accessing services from other places or even from SAGE itself. I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, I think also the idea of being a safe space can be really important. I think when folks walk into a SAGE Senior Center, they see all kinds of people. And that can be really powerful. And being able to be in a space that's meant for older people, but is also expressly LGBT affirming is important. Bill, what else is there?
I think you nailed it. Yeah, it's an ongoing work for us to be aware of the multiple layers of trauma that our participants face, not only because of their sexual orientation and their gender identity, and an awareness of how it might impact them and their relationships with us as well as providers. I think it's so important to kind of be aware of those dynamics and be respectful of them. There's a question about, I'll answer a question about our affiliates outside of New York City. How do they handle communities where there might not be as open acceptance outside of major cities? Yeah, so we have affiliates we have 30 affiliates across the country from Alaska to Puerto Rico. And obviously some of them are in areas that are less accepting towards LGBTQ people. They are usually much smaller agencies that are supported in their work by SAGE. They provide many of the same services though that SAGE does. They have support groups, they have programming that is LGBT specific, they give referrals, they provide advocacy work. So I do think that especially in those communities where that are less accepting towards these communities, these affiliates are doing incredible work in places where it's really necessary. And I would say I'm not specifically aware of some of the work they do, but I know that it's similar to SAGE, so I'm sure that it is mostly around creating a safe space for the people who go there. Julie, I'm going to let you take this next one. Can you talk a little more about the support for volunteers?
Yes, happily. We offer volunteer support both from us as social workers and folks who have sort of known our clients and know about their needs a little bit. And we also offer peer support, so volunteers helping each other and sharing their experiences with each other. For SAGEConnect, we have bi-weekly meetings, which are on a little summer break right now, but we'll come back to them. And those are a chance to sort of troubleshoot together, but also just, share what's going well, share what's not working as well. And then we also do supervision with our friendly visiting volunteers every other month. And that is sometimes a similar structure of just peers talking with each other, and other times is a little bit more sort of organized or official. So we've had speakers talk to us about self-care, about working with people with dementia. So sort of making sure we're giving volunteers this like more concrete knowledge that's important for their work as well.
For sure, and many of our volunteers are quite younger. I mean, as you saw some of those pictures, we have volunteers starting at age 21 who come to us wanting to work with this community, which is so wonderful and so exciting. And it's interesting that the age range has been started to go down even since I came to SAGE 6 years ago. When I came to SAGE, a lot of our friendly visitors were primarily, I would say, in their 40s. And just within 6 years, a lot of our volunteers are in their 30s and their 20s. But what comes with that is perhaps a little bit less experience when it comes to death and dying, when it comes to having the social skills sometimes that are necessary in these things. And Julie does such a wonderful job in the ways she talked about in terms of supporting these communities of volunteers. Let's see, we have time for just a couple, maybe one or two. While Well, I'm going to answer this question really quickly, and then I'm going to, Julie, get ready for it. The last question we're going to answer is, what do you enjoy most about working with this community? So get ready for that one. But I wanted to answer a question just before talking about the Latin community, the Latinx community, and what services we provide. I'm really interested to hear about this community. Yes. So we do provide services that are specific to the Latinx community, specifically Spanish-speaking support groups of various different kinds. We do make sure that we have, hopefully we'll get better and better at this, much of our material translated into Spanish. We do have Spanish-speaking care managers who can support this community for those folks who are monolingual. And so it's certainly an ongoing emphasis to try to find ways of providing support that's specific to this and other communities within the LGBT umbrella. So, what do you enjoy most, Julie?
Oh my gosh, we need another hour just to get into the favorite parts of the job. I think there's sort of, well, there's like what I love about Sage clients, and there's what I love about working with our volunteers. I think our volunteers are just such open-hearted people who come with just such a spirit of service that really excites me every single day and makes me really happy to be able to be working with them and supporting them. And then I think just being able to be a witness to our clients and the communities that they've built, the strengths that they've built, is also really, really a blessing. Yeah.
I will second that. If any of you, and we're still not having an in-person Pride this year, but next year, when I assume Pride will be in person, and if you can get to New York, if you're not here now, come just for the Sage float, because I don't know how many of you who are New Yorkers have seen it, but it is I get weepy even just describing it. It is the most beautiful thing, because you have on there people, some of them in wheelchairs, and some are being pushed in wheelchairs. Some of them are on this big double-decker bus that we rent for the day. And all along the parade route, instead of just kind of people screaming and shouting on the sidelines as they do with all the other floats, when the Sage float comes down down the street, people are yelling, "Thank you." And just to be the witness to that, to see these populations getting the recognition and the thanks they deserve for paving the way for so many of us, that is what I love most about working with this population, the fact that I am supporting people who supported me before I came to be. So we're out of time. Jennifer, we really appreciate you having us.
I am, first of all, I'm feeling a little teary hearing about the float. And I'm in New York, so I do plan on seeing that, because it's absolutely beautiful to think about and to honor this community. Thank you so much. This was incredibly informative. I will admit, I knew of Sage way back when, but not to this extent. So the work you guys are doing and the resources you're providing are tremendous. And the housing, I loved the plug for the super sex class, phenomenal. And the senior centers, I mean, there's nothing better than bringing people together and normalizing just what it is to be a person and to need connection. So thank you for all that you're doing. And thank you so much for your time and wealth of knowledge. And I guess until we see you at Pride.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride, yeah.
So happy Pride. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining. Please go to Sage's website if you have any questions. Episcopal Actors Guild and MusiCares. And thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.